Welcome to another of our Fruitful Field consultation podcasts. The consultation started on the 17th of October. It runs through to Christmas, finishing on the 23rd of December. So please remember to get your thoughts to us. Now, the podcast is going to make a lot more sense to you if you've had a look at the document. It's quite a long document, but it's well worth having a look at. It sets out all the proposals about this process, and you can find it at methodist.org.uk/fruitful field. That's methodist.org.uk/fruitful field. Now, I'm joined by the Reverend Dr. Martyn Atkins. Martyn is the General Secretary of the Methodist Church, but he's also convener of the Ministries Committee, which was charged by the Methodist Conference to produce this set of proposals. And today we're going to talk about ministerial training, Martyn, because we've had a lot of questions about ministerial training in response to the proposals in the report. And in an earlier podcast, we were talking to Mark Hammond, who's also a Methodist minister. Now, he suggested that one of the things the Ministries Committee is keen to do is do a whole people of God training project, so training worship leaders, training small group leaders, looking at how we equip a lot of the lay ministries as well as the ordained ministries. And he suggested that the amount of resource put into the ordained ministries is disproportionate. Now, I'm sure that lots of people are thinking, but actually presbyteral and diaconal ministries are essential to the life of the church. They might feel that that's being sidelined in these proposals. How would you respond to that?
I don't think they've been sidelined at all. I mean, I think I understand what Mark is saying, Anna, and that is that the backdrop to this, if I can just rehearse it very briefly, is that we're currently spending a substantial amount of money every year, more than we actually have for the overall package of learning. And at the same time, the conference has repeatedly said to us that it wants to identify and specify and resource ministries like you've mentioned, and therefore we have a contracting budget and a desire of the conference to spend more of our proportionate resources on other things than ordained ministry. I can well understand that then a group of people say, so ordained ministry is less important or being downgraded. I understand that, but I don't think it's true at all. In fact, I would argue that the proposals in this document, with its question about one hub being sufficient, is actually not a dilution of resources, it's actually a concentration of good resources. Because at the moment, the amount of money that we do spend on ministerial training is a large amount of money. Well over 3 million, possibly over £3.5 million. And if you look at simply, this is a silly equation, but if you look at simply the number of people who are on ordination tracks, that makes a very important, a very expensive kind of framework. The Fruitful Field consultations actually says, if you gathered them together in one place, I will come to how the different routes of this, and actually paid only one lot of council tax and one lot of this, that and the other, what would happen is that the experience, the facilities, the experience of being ordained or training for ordination would become actually ever better. But it would require some very hard decisions about how and in what shape that took place. So downgrading or reducing the importance of ordination, not at all. God raised Methodism, and it's enshrined in our foundational documents as a movement of both lay people and ministry in partnership together in God's kingdom work called into God's church. And therefore I do not want to lose the importance of those who God calls. Connectionally, we identify that call, we recognise God's call in that group of people, and we reflect with them prayerfully how they are going to be trained in response to God's call. And for some people, that means that they're called to be presbyters and deacons. And what we need to do is learn all we've learned in a very fast-moving context about what the best kind of training for those people is. I've got no desire whatsoever to not make them a very important feature in Fruitful Field.
But they will be affected. I mean, ministerial training will be dramatically affected by these proposals. And currently we have a kind of two-track scheme almost. We have full-time ministerial training, we have part-time ministerial training for those who candidate to be deacons or presbyters. And one of the concerns I think that people have is that when they candidate, especially for full-time ministry, they end up, moving quite often their families, or kind of creating quite strange commuting where they're going to one place for midweek and then going home for weekends. Would creating a central hub exacerbate that, because essentially things will be even further apart?
Well, the first thing to say is that whatever happens in the hub, if the report recommends that to conference, if it's passed, if that's where we're beginning to work, we must recognise that there are challenges. Challenges doesn't mean it's not a good idea. You've already articulated that we have two broad paths, part-time training and full-time training. But actually, it's more varied than that now. It's the way in which people do ordination track training is hugely various and hugely messy, and that's all right. So, for instance, when I trained to be a minister, and I suspect some of the people listening to the podcast or thinking of there simply being one hub, they're making the understandable but nevertheless mistaken view that one hub simply means one ancient college institution like it was when I was trained 30 years ago, located somewhere with everybody from around the country doing full-time training, uprooting everything and living there like in a monastery for a considerable period of time. Actually, most ordination training has not been like that for years anyway. And you've already said that some people do full-time training and live in a home and travel on a Tuesday morning and then have a compression of sort of experiences, and then they go home on Wednesday afternoon, and the rest of the time they're mapping out what it means in situ. They might be working with a local circuit, they might be on a long-term placement. All this good stuff is happening because we've got good people in our existing colleges who learn how people learn best for ministry today. So we mustn't make the mistake that somehow a move to the hub is somehow a dramatic change for everybody's experience as being called into ministry. Now, that said, if you have one place, you have one place alongside distributive learning. And what we've got to do, together with the people in the tutors, the people who already operate with students, who are finding good practices all the time to deal with contemporary people with demanding lives and complicated existences in terms of work, spouses, children, dependent relatives, etc., etc. And all that is a challenge, and let me say before I go on, in every generation, everybody called by God has had to count the cost of that. It doesn't mean we make it artificially hard or easy, but everybody has sat down and said, part of my obedience to God is to now recognise that this might be the consequence of it. So some people would say, gosh, making a 200-mile trip every week to go to such and such for what amounts to three lectures, one on a Tuesday, one on a Wednesday, that's the cost I'm already paying. So that it's not costless now and suddenly become very costly if we move to one hub. But
so we're talking about creating different ways.
Yes, this is what I'm coming to. I think that already there are more different ways out there than we're giving credit for, and therefore, at least technically, if the distributed, no, not more than technically, if the distributed work of the training networks, whatever emerges, works, and if we have a hub which is a gathering and dispersing place, there is huge flexibility for how people, human beings in different circumstances, do all sorts of attractive and inventive best practice routes whereby they become trained for our ministry. It's not that or that. And I think that actually we're at the beginning, a cusp of sharing together as groups of people who have enormous experience, contemporary experience about how to do this well. Then what the Fruitful Field will do, if as and when we go down that route, is gather them round the table and say, look, you're the experts. How does this best work?
So rather than cutting those links, we're going to ask them to feed into the actual detailed proposals.
Yes. And I think this is, if I might say so, this is one of the general things about the consultation, that we are having a tendency in some people, not by all, to say that what we've got is absolutely great, so why are we doing anything with it? And everything that we're envisaging is somehow a less than, poorer than dismantling of what we've got. And I'm here to say on this podcast, I have no interest whatsoever in being a member of a 15-person group, albeit working in very difficult financial circumstances, that will put up with poorer, smaller, more marginalised, less resourced, less integrated learning institutions for Methodism. But I actually don't believe that that's a natural consequence or an inevitability about what we're proposing. I think one hub could actually be diverse, could get best practice, hold within it hugely attractive and inventive ways of doing training in relation to the rest of the connection. And we've got people out there who know how to do it.
And I'm going to ask you to look into the future a little bit on two counts. Firstly, if these proposals are accepted by the Methodist people, if the conference decides to go ahead with things in the summer of 2012, how do you think that will affect people who are thinking about candidating for ministry, people who detect a call in their lives to ordained ministry, who are now thinking, well, what will happen if I'm going to go to training in 2015? How will that kind of affect their approach to that, do you think?
I don't know. I can't leap inside their minds to know that, Anna. What I hope would be the case, and I think it's been the case now, we take enormous discernment and care over how we identify with a person, whether they're called by God, and have conversations with them now as to what kind of training, what kind of recipe, and where and how. We're a connectional church. We don't recruit people and then send them to the appropriate institution because of a theological bias or because they're called to be ministers in the Methodist Church. We recognise that and we work out the best context and package, if you like, or pattern through which we believe God will continue to enable them to develop to be the people who serve the church that we want them to be. My hunch will be, my commitment, as much as it lies with me, will be with the other members of the committee, is that we find in the new patterns the same kind of care, the same kind of discernment, and possibly an even more creative and more attractive collection of possibilities and pathways that thrill them and that are part of that journey that says there is a cost to be paid to be a Christian disciple called into ministry. I'm willing to pay that cost, and I'm exploring with the church the ways in which, the places in which, the manner in which I become the kind of person God wants me to be. I hope that is in their mind, because it's that mixture of demand and that sense of call and the excitement of being called by God that I hope we don't lose either of those two things in any generation.
And if we do press ahead with the proposals, what do you think the church might look like as a result? Because they are significant, dramatic proposals. We've not seen a kind of proposed reworking of the church's structures for training like this for a very, very long time, if ever. What do you think? It will inevitably affect every area of the church. What do you think the church might look like in, say, 20, 30 years' time?
In 20, 30 years' time, I haven't a clue. One of my friends is a futurologist in the university, and he used to tell me that sort of 70 years ago, when it was a new science, you wouldn't get a job unless you could tell pretty accurately what was going to happen for about 40 or 50 years. And he now says you won't get a job if you pretend you know what's going to happen any further than 5 years' time, because the world's changing so fast. So it's a bit of an unfair question. What I would say is that the way in which we have dealt with this, which means that this is taking this so seriously, has been a recurrent and actually an ever-increasingly recurrent argument, debate, situation in the church, whereby the effects of which have been the doing away with another institution leaving X. We've done it rather like a circuit that said, well, we've got 27 churches, one closes, we've got 26. How do we do the same thing with smaller numbers? At least what the Fruitful Field consultation document does is what the church has asked it to do, and that is looking at the future, looking at education now, looking at adulthood now, looking at how people learn now, looking at who they are and what the church needs for the future. Is it a sufficiently robust policy to go on every 3 or 4 years working out which current institution is now on the hit list next? And therefore what I would hope is that if we are courageous and robust and thorough, and we must be all of those things about the Fruitful Field consultation, what I hear Methodists and people in existing colleges saying to me is, whatever the future is, it mustn't be a recycling every 3 or 4 years of this debate. Whatever we put in place, it must be at least flexible enough and malleable enough to serve us for a short generation before we actually think again, what are we doing? So what will it look like? I think it will be exciting. I think it will be flexible. I think it will always be a mixture of those new patterns of learning, about learning in situ. It will be about gathering and dispersing and shared knowledge and feeling a group of a coterie of people, a feeling part of a church that I hope has a new sense of direction and call and energy about it, and a sense in which God has not given up on us, and that we are part of what God is doing in God's kingdom purposes, rather than simply working within a church that's got a sort of mindset of its own, devoid from the world. And I would hope that the conference, in making its decisions, whatever it makes in this summer, enables us to follow those patterns so that we're not round this table having another set of conversations about which single institution goes to the wall, which is an inevitable sadness, but we've done it several times before, and then the rest breathe a huge sigh of relief for 3 or 4 years. We've got to move out of that cycle, and this enables us to do it.
And we're very, very nearly out of time, but before we finish this podcast, which is the last in the series that we're doing on the consultation.
Thank you, Anna.
My pleasure. And just wanted to ask you to reflect, for those listening or watching, about how you found the process from conference charging the Ministries Committee to do this through to presenting the connection with this document and up until now.
Well, the actual gathering together of the document by the committee was a huge amount of work, and one of the things that I've said repeatedly, but I'll say again, is the amount of deep knowledge that committee went through in order to make the proposals is a thing of trust. I say to the Methodist people, I have never been in a group where so much deep research knowledge and hard facts were sifted through to make the consultation document. And it may well be, as we move from the consultation period, that some of that deep knowledge then becomes into the new processes as necessary. So that's the past. The actual consultation process I found exciting. I found it exhausting. I think with some of our colleagues, we've batted around institutions and tried to respond to a whole multiplicity of people saying, will you just come and talk to us about this? So even right up to Christmas, I'm sort of jumping in a car in the early hours of the morning and being 200 miles away for 10 o'clock and then coming back in the afternoon. But the important thing to say, because we're moving to a close, Hannah, is again and wonderfully, the vast majority of the consultation feedback that we're getting either from individuals or groups, even including those who are profoundly affected by the possible implications of this consultation, has been marked by grace, by patience and politeness. There has been a few explosions of anger. People have been frustrated and they have been angry, and in those cases I think we've said to ourselves, well, they need somewhere to vent that passion and that anger, so it better be us for a while. So there's been some of that, but overwhelmingly we have been gracious with one another as Christian people, plunged into a deeply significant area of our life of our church, where passions do run high, where we've got to get this right, but where there is no avoiding some very hard questions, and I think we've dealt with that honourably. And my last word would be to say to those who've joined in the consultation and might even yet do so, thank you so much for being good Christian disciples through this challenging process. We now look towards the end of the process. Bear in mind the 15 people on this committee who will receive, no doubt, a sort of a wagon, a post office van on its own with the digest of this, and alongside their tinsel and turkey, what they'll be doing is wading through this stuff, but conscientiously and thoroughly, and then we begin in the new year to work out what we do with it all.
And if you're listening or watching and you have yet to contribute to the consultation, there is still time. Please get your contributions in by the end of 23rd of December, just before you go off to celebrate Christmas. And that's at methodist.org.uk/Fruitful Field. You'll also be able to find the other videos that we've done there, and we hope that those are helpful for you. And Martyn, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Anna.
And happy Christmas.
Yes, and you, yes. Bless you.